wait for the late folks. So who wants to go next?
I can go.
Okay, fire away.
Cool. So my analysis is on the Haitian Revolution, or I should say case study is on the Haitian Revolution. Going into just like a brief history prior to decolonization revolution, the Spanish were actually the first to colonize Haiti in 1492. They first encountered the Taino people, which were the indigenous population of the territory. And basically they took advantage of the development gap, right? Like where these were, more tribal people, they obviously took the place in, not necessarily by force, actually. It was actually a pretty peaceful encounter. But over time, it did quickly become exploited by the Spanish, as things do with colonists. And it was actually predominantly exploited for gold at the time, from what I'm reading. They renamed the area Santo Domingo. And I believe it was in 1606, inhabitants were ordered to move closer to Santo Domingo, which is when the French, English, and Dutch started to establish their own bases within the abandoned northwest coast of the island, which would eventually become Haiti. When was it 1665, it was officially the French colonization was officially recognized. And it was actually renamed Saint Dominique, which I'm probably totally butchering that. And I kind of feel like that's the same name, but I could totally be wrong. Sounds like it. But they actually exploited it better than the Spanish did, however you want to see that. And they actually exploited it for goods. And so the Spanish had not done a proper job, I guess, of exploiting the land at that point. At the outset of the revolution, so this was actually between roughly the time when the French took over to the outset of revolution, which if I remember correctly is 1791. It was basically a settler colony, but it was heavily involved in trade. At the time, it produced 60% of the world's coffee, 40% of the sugar, if I remember correctly. My notes are correct. But they also exported like coca, molasses, and indigo. They were one of the main suppliers of the world's sugar. They were also an importer and exporter of slaves. They imported a ton of slaves, but it was also like a good strategic point wise, like it was a good trade route between Europe and the Americas. So they were able to export slaves to the Americas. The total value of like the crops and the goods were almost like of all the products that were shipped from the colonies. So it brought in a lot of profit. They were basically kind of separate when it comes to the structure of like the occupation or the administration. It was kind of the demographics, I guess, would be kind of separated into, the whites, the free persons of color, and the slave population, as well as the escaped slaves, which were, which I have the French versions of this. It was basically literally the whites, like les blancs. And then you had like the big whites and the small whites, the grand blancs and the petit blancs. I'm probably butchering that. I'm trying to say this with a French accent, totally screwing that up probably. But they only were around about 40,000 people. So the big whites were basically the plantation owners, the minor aristocrats. They mainly lived in France, but they would have excursions to the land, whenever they felt. I don't know if it was necessary. I don't know their internal politics in that sense, but they held most of the power and controlled most of the property. And then you have the small whites, which were like the lower class artisans, the slave dealers, overseers, the laborers, and they held a lot of the local power. And you also had, of course, free persons of color, which were around 28,000. So just comparatively, 40,000 whites and then free persons of color, 28,000, typically of like African and French descent. They were able to purchase their freedom or inherit their freedom from their parents. They were typically the educated and literate, they were educated and literate. They controlled a lot of the land and wealth of the European planters as well. They were segregated, however, they were limited to where they could live, and they must wear distinctive clothing and could not occupy many public offices. And then you had like the slave population, which was exponentially larger, right? As of 1789, it was above 450,000. Some estimates were saying like 500,000, but I'm just going with the lower one. They were typically African born, but there were also Creoles who were slaves born in the colonies, which were typically given more prestigious roles. And those were like, you know, people that would be more servants, so not necessarily labor. And then you had like escaped slaves, which were called Maroons, and they typically lived away from the cities or in the hillsides. They lived off the land, or they would raid plantations for like sugar and coffee or tools and weapons, etc. And some actually were known to have fled to towns to blend into the local population. So roughly you have like, you know, poor middle class and rich aristocratic whites, native whites, French whites, free persons of color, who roughly, you know, envied those that were higher than them because they could not, you know, they wanted to achieve those same things, but could obviously not because they were structurally segregated. But they also like had antagonism towards slaves, and were also kind of despised by whites due to the racism and their envy to control, like I mentioned. So it's kind of a weird position to be in, which I want to like emphasize that more. Like I need to do a little bit more research on this because I am kind of curious about that kind of like disparity, because in the end of all this, you know, it's them uniting with slaves and, you know, coming together to try to form this kind of Haitian identity. So I want to kind of like know a little bit more about like that, where that position is at that point in time. So that's something I know I need to do more of. And then you had like, you know, the ones that were born on the island, the slaves that were born on the island, and the slaves that were actually coming from Africa, which also had, there was like a disparity there, in the sense that there was like some antagonism there. And from what this French historian, but which is, you know, has to be taken with a grain of salt because he's a French historian, this is a colonizer, Paul Fregosi, again, probably butchering that name, had mentioned is that basically everyone lived in terror of everyone else. So it was kind of an area that seems to be like ripe for revolution. In regards to like the region, the northern province had like more fertile plantations and therefore more slaves, had greater economic importance, and most trade went through those ports. And this will actually end up being, with this region will actually end up being where the first slave revolts start. And then you have the Western province, which was separated from the rest of the colony and actually allowed freed slaves to find more profit within like trade, specifically with like Jamaica. So it was easier for them to gain power and wealth in that area. And then of course you had, you know, conflicts that would occur between proponents of independence. As these conversations start happening, people who want to achieve independence from France, and then, you know, those who obviously were still actually loyal. I mean, just like I believe in America, where you had the loyalists and you had people that actually wanted to be independent. When it comes to like private actors, you know, this was kind of, again, like kind of mentioned that before, we had like the French, the Dutch, and the English, and it was kind of a weird situation because during the process of the revolution, you're going to have the revolutionaries kind of like playing, I don't want to say playing both sides, but from what it seems is like they do side with the French, I mean, not the French, the Spanish initially, to be able to gain like freedom and, you know, potentially independence, and then end up siding with the French again. But that's another part of it. So as this colony starts to like evolve and you start to like have these different demographics, including like specifically the ones that are Creole, and they start to be have, you know, higher, they're more access, have more access to education, are more literate, that kind of development gap shrank, from what it seems. And they're, you know, I think we've definitely talked about in classes, like when you have people that are more educated and more aware and more able to take advantage of the structures that you have in the colony, like they know it well enough to be able to potentially identify its weaknesses and potentially break it down, but also to want more, right? Like who wouldn't want that in that sense? And then so kind of when it comes to the catalyst of revolution, obviously you have, you know, colonialist power, like these people are being completely exploited. There's another part that I need to follow up on this, but I read, like I did a cursory glance at this, and then like the Taino culture supposedly was gone by this point. I need to like also get a little bit more thorough on that one because I want to understand that one more. But they were kind of gone at this point, so that the culture, the indigenous culture, had been, you know, eliminated from at least that region. And so there was still like, even as such, there was still like this alterity, obviously, that existed between, you know, the people that had developed this kind of notion of what it means to be Haitian, as opposed to like those that were coming from France, and they grew up in France. So when it came to like individual leaders that kind of like arose within this system, And you have like the first leader, like I'm gonna butcher this name as well, Vincent Oge. It's like OGE, and I'm just gonna butcher that. But he demanded like the right to vote under the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, and he led a brief 300-man insurgency around Le Cap, which was in the north, to end racial discrimination. But he was captured in 1791 and brutally executed. But he was cited as one of the factors in not wanting to bargain with the colonial powers in the future aspects of the revolution. There is also Toussaint Louverture, which I'm again probably butchering, and he actually began to accumulate wealth and property, and he actually owned a plantation, owned slaves, and he supposedly acquired like a reasonable fortune. I need to like get multiple sources on this because I'm really only deriving this from one, and that's another kind of lack in this aspect of research. But he was a well-educated and supposedly had received some of his education from Jesuit missionaries. A next major leader after that would be, and again I'm going to butcher this, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Dessalines. I'm going to completely destroy that. And incidentally, though, he's the one that actually takes over after Toussaint, and he actually is the one that actually leads what would eventually become known as Haiti to independence. There are actually a bunch of other leaders I have on here, like these are all French names, and I'm going to totally destroy it. The most easiest one is like Henry Christophe. Sorry.
Okay. A couple of things. This is very thorough, but we have a lot of people who have to go. So
okay,
you're
quick.
You're,
Okay,
you're
I can end this.
10-minute
totally
mark. There's at least one thing you've left out.
What's that?
And that is the significance of the French Revolution.
The French Revolution occurred at the same time. Wasn't it like
1789, roughly 92 before you have the reaction to it. But
right.
The idea is this all happens about Latin America too, where there were revolutions at home that made colonial administration problematic. Just something to think about.
No, for sure. Like Enlightenment thought definitely comes into that, and that it's a major player. I was just kind of skipping over it because I do have a lot of info on that.
But I'm just saying, in your final version, make sure that you take a look at that and decide for yourself how significant it is. Again, historians differ on exactly how significant it was, but most historians mention it.
No, for sure. And actually that happened with the American Revolution as well, as like people, from what I've read, there seems to be a lot of discussion around that as well. As like, was this influential? Was it not? Was it as influential as people are saying?
Kennedy thinks it was.
Right. Yeah. And so like, just to cap this, there was a little bit of coercion and conciliation on both ends, right? Like at the end of a lot of these battles, they did end slavery, but for these people at this point in time, they wanted more than just ending slavery. They wanted independence. They wanted that unique Haitian, I don't know what to say here, nationality to come out to come to fruition. Yeah. And so then that did lead to war, and that did lead to coercion. And so, yeah, that'll be the cap on that.
That is the quickest and densest flyover of the Haitian Revolution I think I've ever heard. Not bad.
That's the best I could do.
And French names, I do not fault you.
Okay, thank you.
It's an absolutely repellent language. I have no use for it. It sounds like tape played backwards.
Better. For sure.
But yeah,
no, I heard you were doing Haiti, and I was like, this is going to be difficult just to explain.
Yeah.
It's a lot of info.
All right, very quickly, any questions or comments?
I was just going to say, I also was doing the decolonization of Haiti, and my flyover was going to be a lot of the same things. So I can just go next and maybe add on some things that weren't touched on.
Okay.
If you would want.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to repeat like the same, timeline of things that everybody just
Not
heard,
only that, but I would suggest, if you haven't already, that at some point the two of you might want to compare notes on sources. Help each other out. Feel free.
For sure.
It's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
So I'll just touch on a couple like key events and things that weren't talked about. The first thing that I found in a lot of my sources is there was a lot of stress on the four kind of groups of people within the colony, the tension between those groups, the tension between the planters, the free people of color, the slaves, and the free whites. They had the French names. I'm not going to try any of them. But there was a severe amount of tension between those groups. So that was one thing for sure I found in a lot of my sources. And then just some more key events, catalytic events triggering. In 1789, the slaves heard that they heard of the Declaration of Rights and Citizen. And that kind of started a lot of the push and movement towards freedom because they heard of this. And it was a rumor at this point. And that also led to the free whites seizing the Port of Prince in 1791. And Port-au-Prince is currently the biggest city in Haiti, and at the time was a major port. So that was also a huge effect on the movement of the plantations. And then let's see, what else do I got that I can add here? So 1791, full French citizenship to all free men of color. That kind of was what I read as like the big, I don't want to say like the final catapult to the full-blown slave revolt, but that was like the last kind of straw is what I saw. And then let's see.
Would you argue that that was an attempt at conciliation that misfired?
I read that in a couple things, but I saw kind of different, a couple of my sources had differing opinions
Okay,
on that.
just it's one of those things that people kick around.
Yeah, no, for sure. I
Okay.
definitely did see that a couple times, but I saw some arguments against.
Okay.
We got the slaves were freed at February 4th, 1794, but that kind of, decolonization didn't sprout off from there because of the war was still going on in the colony. So that kind of ushered in the second wave. I saw a lot of talk of like first and second waves of this revolt before and after that event.
Part of what you'll find there in the bridge between first and second wave, when you mentioned the tensions between groups before, is the attempt to reconcile those differences and unify them. And that goes in fits and starts. So that might be what you're seeing.
Yeah, for sure. And then another thing to add to was during that second wave, the slaves were also greatly aided. I saw a lot of talk of the yellow fever that was wiping out a lot of people at the time. So that was kind of a addition that helped them through that.
Yep.
I think that's most of what I have that wasn't touched on.
Okay. No, but the things you brought up would augment Johanna's analysis really well. In other words, it's sort of like you did a little deeper dive on a couple of things and she gave more of the flyover. But between the two of you, I think pretty well captured it thematically. That's pretty good.
The only thing I'm currently
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just saying the only thing I'm currently still looking at as the like aftermath. I'm kind of right now in the deep dive of like the follow-up of what was left after, okay, Declaration of Independence, Haiti is like the name the country. Now what's to come after? That's kind of where I'm at.
Which should be the least of your concerns.
Yeah.
You don't need to worry about that. Remember, the subject matter here is decolonization. What comes after that, again, I've talked to a couple of you independently, and the idea is, look, just if you can bring it in for a landing in a paragraph and say, there was mostly what you find is there was tremendous optimism and then it all turned to shit. Some variation on that. That's fine, but you don't have to go into any kind of excruciating detail on that because it's really beyond the scope of the analysis.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right. Again, any comments or questions?
Oh, I just thought it might be really cool to add, just to add to your point about the yellow fever, because I remember that as soon as you said it, like that really did contribute, because it basically decimated the French troops and the mercenaries, which would eventually turn because they didn't want to like deal with like having to deal with the yellow fever, but also like to I can't remember what their mercenaries were from though. That's the only part that I can't remember. But it was definitely a major contributing factor to like the decimation of the French troops, as well as guerrilla warfare as usual. I forgot about that part as well.
Yeah, I mean that's one of my favorite parts. It being a revolution. You can't beat that good old insurgency asymmetrical warfare. There's nothing cooler.
For sure.
Unfortunately. But anyway, yeah, I think that's quite good. I now this is good because I have two people analyzing the same case. So I can kind of put those together as a set and see how they go. Okay, who is next? Paul, you want to go?
Sure.
Okay.
I probably won't have as much to say. I haven't quite delved into the tight details yet. but I'm doing mine on Angola, and it was a Portuguese colony from around like 1670, 71, I believe. And they had mainly it was used as like a slave trading colony up until the slave trade was abolished, but it was primarily around the coastal regions in Luanda that were mostly of interest to the Portuguese and Europeans. It wasn't until the 20s, until after like the Berlin Conference, that Portugal really pushed inland and actually tried to take control of the more sovereign inner areas of Angola. So that was around when the Estado Novo came into power. And so I'm going to discuss that. I'm going to discuss how the like increase in hard-handed military tactics around that time, when they were started to take over more of the industries in the interior, how that affected Angola, and how it wound up with in between 55 and 65 with the development of the UNITA and the MPLA and the FNLA. And so I'm going to go in and talk about the development of those groups and how they were in response to Portuguese influence, and then go on to talk about the Carnation Revolution and the Alvar agreements, and talk about how that kind of set the country up for the 30-year civil war that followed. And yeah, so I've got like a good outline on most of it, and I just need to go in and like really do a deep dive on some of my sources and get the full details out of them.
Sorry, I always forget when I mute my microphone. I apologize. Just as the French Revolution has been argued to have been pretty significant to, and the American anti-colonial struggle as well, significant to the Caribbean and parts of South America, you have a kind of coup / soft revolution occurring in Portugal at that time too.
Yeah, the Carnation Revolution.
Yeah, and be sure and don't take it for granted. Really try to think about, not just say it was influential, but see if you can figure out actually how it played out within the colonial territories. There's some disagreement in terms of how important. I mean, obviously it's an indispensable component of decolonization. It's one of those catalytic events that we look for, beyond which you can see, okay, this is going to come apart. Yeah, just something to think about. But you mentioned it. I mean, it wasn't. I'm not suggesting that you had overlooked it.
Is there anything else that you would say that I am missing or needs more context? Or
I would say, you mentioned again, you gave us the flyover.
Yeah.
Why both MPLA and UNITA? What was the difference between them and why?
Yeah, I mean the MPLA was the backed by the communists, and we kind of supported UNITA coming in through South Africa.
That shows what the external support base was, but what was happening internally, because those people fought for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Other than that, no, I think you've nailed it. That's a good summary.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay. See, these things aren't as hard as you think. Who wants to go next?
I could go next.
Okay, Jesus, go ahead.
All right. So my Wi-Fi is kind of jumpy, so just give me a heads up if it cuts off. I'm talking about the so my case is about Mexico between 1521 and 1821, and it's about the colonization from Spain. So a little background with indigenous diversity is the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Cholula, Texcoco, Tlacopan, and the Matalan made the Mexico area, or what we call now Mexico. But it's very important to understand that between these indigenous groups, there's smaller groups. For example, the Aztecs were actually 3 different groups: the Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, that made the Aztec Empire. So a little bit of geography is that Mexico is located between the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. Being connected to the Gulf of Mexico is an advantage to the Spanish because it opens rivers into Mexico, and also Mexico's covered in mountains and rainforests. But the most important city in the area is Tenochtitlan. It's the Aztec capital, and it's built on an island called Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico. The city was the main empire or the main capital of the empire until the Spanish conquest. The city was connected to the mainland by bridges leading north, south, and west. When other like indigenous groups would come and I guess try to attack the Aztecs, they would just pull the bridges away and defend the city. And so during this time, jumping to the Spanish, so the Spanish learned of Mexico during the Juan de Grivala expedition in 1518. But the Spanish conquest didn't happen until the year after, with Hernan Cortés, who landed on the Gulf Coast and founded the city of Veracruz. And around 500 conquistadores with horses, cannons, and swords, and long guns gave the Spanish some technological advantages over the indigenous groups. But the main key that many sources gave was them being able to make alliances with other indigenous groups that were against the Aztecs. For example, the Tlazalacan and the Totonocapan. And because of this, they were able to be the Aztec Triple Alliance. That was the three main cities on the lake. And as they conquered Mexico, they got new land. Spain plundered lots of resources from their colonies. Example, chocolate and maize, aka corn. They opened up trade in the continent and got profits and spread Christianity. By the time of independence, the main export of New Spain was the mining silver from agriculture and corn tobacco. So the main so this is what I found about the colonial administration was the church, state, and crown. Under the church, they were converted into Catholics and taught Spanish. And the first royal judicial body established in New Spain by 1927 was the Audiencia de Mexico City. This consisted of 4 judges who held executive and legislative powers, but the crown saw that they needed some royal authority. And so by then they made the Viceroy of New Spain, and that was Antonio de Mendoza. His duties were extensive but excluded judicial matters that went to the Audiencia. And so like jumping to 1810, because that's when the decolonization efforts started. So between those 2 periods, there were many times that the Mexican people were trying to decolonize, but it was mostly wealthy men. And because of that, it didn't really stick to it. But until, so there was like what I found 2 triggering anti-colonial struggles, or the catalyst that happened to it, was the Bourbon Reform. It was where the power of the Spanish state decreased the power of the Catholic Church. And because of this, any Spanish-born official would be picked over any American-born, meaning person who was born in New Spain, for a position in the elite. So because of this, a lot of the people who were Spanish, or parents were Spanish but born in New Spain, did not get. They were not chosen over to get any power. So it happened. There was a little pushback against it. But the second triggering event, and probably the most important, was the Hidalgo revolt. That was when Hidalgo, a Catholic priest, sparked a movement of independence in Mexico, and he inspired tens of thousands of ordinary men to follow him. But the thing is that they were not well prepared, and it didn't work out. But because of that, it gave like the people a push for independence. And so as I mentioned before, there was for the process of I can't pronounce it right now. So it was the anti-colonial movement was ethnic, because the Spanish divided everyone into mestizos, castizos, mulatos, and lobos. So if you were Spanish born or Spanish parents but born in New Spain, or indigenous plus Spanish or African with indigenous descent, you will be placed in a different authority. And because of this, like a lot of them got together for the start. And many sources were talking about how it was not a single event when the independence happened. It was different events around the country. It was local and regional struggles that occurred within the same time period that be considered a revolutionary civil war within the country against the Spanish Empire. But also, a lot of people said that independence would not happened if not of the Peninsular War in Spain between the French and the Spanish. Because of that, it was like I guess a two frontier war, I guess. I don't know how like it's called, but it had a direct effect against Spanish. And because of this, it was because of the it had an impact on the outbreak. So by the end, there was a conciliation between both areas. So example, by August 24th, 1821, representatives of the Spanish crown, including the new viceroy, Juan O'Donoghue, and they signed the Treaty of Cordoba, which recognized Mexican independence under the plan of Iguala. But the thing that happened is that the Spanish crown denied that Juan had the power to sign those papers. But by that time, it was too late, and a lot of people were already starting the paperwork of like declaring Mexico as its own country. So by September of that same year, Mexican independence was proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence of the Mexican Empire. But the thing that is super complicated about Mexico and their history is that so after they signed that paper, a lot of former royalists converted into independence movers. And because of this, there was like different beliefs on how the country should run, but that's something completely different because that goes somewhere else. But despite the creation of the Mexican nation, the Spanish still managed to hold a port in Veracruz, where they originally came in from. And that, but they wouldn't have control of that over that port until 1825. And by December of 1836, Spain recognized the independence of Mexico under the Santa Maria Clavarta Treaty, signed in Madrid by the Mexican Minister Miguel Santa Maria and the Spanish State Minister Jose Maria Clavara. And this, because of this, Mexico was the first former colony whose independence was recognized by Spain. And oh yeah, and I was gonna mention other ethnic, like the reason that ethnicity was important, like what I found important was because a lot of the commanders from for like Mexico's independence were like either mulatto or they were just like they united for the same cause. And for example, some Spanish commanders actually switched to the Mexican side because they were Spanish parents born, but Mexico born, or they were born in Mexico.
Okay, you've got a situation there that in some ways is similar to the situation in Haiti and in a lot of the Western Hemisphere in terms of the way that colonies were formed, where a lot of the resistance movement actually comes from people who are at least in part descended from the colonizers, sometimes more so than the colonized. And so it is still decolonization. Otherwise, what would we call the formation of the United States? But ethnicity is extremely important to Mexico, partly because those ethnic distinctions are still important today. And there is still a power structure that in part is race-based in Mexico, that let's say ethnically based. And there is still an extraordinary tendency to repress or disenfranchise ethnic minorities and things like that. You can argue that that was baked in at the time of decolonization, which, Jesus, I think is what you're saying, if I'm understanding you.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. But like when I started talking about it, I kind of get nervous and started like going over things accidentally.
No, don't worry about that. But I think you bring up a really good point. It is one of the more complicated cases we're looking at. I mean, unless you're going to look at something like Afghanistan and just throw out the whole model, yeah, it is complicated. But that's a pretty good summary. Any questions or comments? It is, by the way, a history that very few people living in this country actually know or understand. I don't know why that is, but it's just not, it's not very well understood.
Yeah, like for me, like this always interest. Like I always have a huge interest in Mexico because they have so many like loops and turns, and I was like, why not try this?
Yeah.
And it's a lot.
You know, I like the fact that you're taking on the challenge and you're dealing with all that complexity. And it seems to me that you're finding a way through that morass of countervailing forces and variables and everything and making sense of it. It's a question of whether or not you get lost when you finally try to write this thing down. But that's always the challenge for all of us. You can think it through and have it solid in your head, and then you start writing and it goes away, you know. So beware of that tendency. It's there in all of us. All right, thank you. That's good. Who wants to go? I didn't see any questions or comments, so I think we'll go to Wesley. Are you raising your hand there? Okay.
To go next, yeah.
All right.
All right. So I did my analysis on Russian Alaska. The colonization of Alaska by Russia really started back in the 1500s as they started to expand across Siberia. The expansion across Siberia was really pushed for by the Promyshleniki, who were sort of like serf class in Russia, who were given a lot of independence to go and exploit the fur trade in Siberia. And the Russian crown supported them with armies to protect them and to conquer the land of the Khanate of Sibir. This continued over the years until the 1700s, when Peter the Great, wanting to know whether Siberia connected to Alaska or North America, or they just wanted more land to exploit for the fur trade, sponsored Grigory Shelikov, a Russian nobleman and merchant, to go on an expedition to Alaska and see what he could find. He didn't survive the journey, but the reports that he brought back told of the rich fur that could be the sea otter population in Alaska was huge. So over the next, this was in the 17, anyways. So they made contact with the Aleuts, which live primarily in the Aleutian Islands in southwestern Alaska, and they began exploiting that. The Promyshleniki were
Stop
given,
right there, please. You say they began exploiting that. Who began exploiting what?
Okay. So these fur traders were given pretty much complete control over their trade as long as they had a word for it. There's like a fur tribute that they had to send back to Moscow every once in a while.
So what I'm wondering is,
Yeah,
what does
so,
that have to do? What does that have to do with the Aleut and exploitation? Or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, I kind of having a. I should have maybe written
Then
something.
jump over it and move on.
Okay, so
Sorry.
the Promyshleniki, there weren't that many Russians in Alaska at any point during their colonization. Like the maximum amount was about 800, but they used the same tactics they used for Siberia. A lot of these guys, these fur traders, were from Siberia and not like further west in like the original Moscow, the what was it, the Duchy of Moscova or something before it became an empire. So they were more culturally Siberian, and like they had already been using integration tactics with like the natives, trying to convert them and like marry into their cultures rather than just destroy them in a lot of cases. But due to the large independence each like company was given, each person who formed their own kind of independent economic venture, each interaction with native populations was pretty different. So like in with the Aleuts, so the first largely successful economic venture was championed by Grigory Shelikov and Ivan Larionovich Golikov. They formed the Shelikov-Golikov Company and recruited a bunch of mercenaries and Promushleniki and just Russians looking to make their fortune. And they largely operated in the Aleutian Islands. They, the Shelikov-Golikov Company carried out a campaign of suppression on the native Aleut population, killing a lot of them. There was a smallpox outbreak that decimated or I guess more than decimated, the native population, wiped out a large portion. And this really hurt the Russian American company's prospects. So the Shelikov-Golikov Company was very hostile to the native population. They practiced like hostage taking. The Promushleniki, who were traditionally fur traders in Siberia, were used to hunting inland, and the Aleutian Islands are a bunch of islands. The Aleuts had a culture based around hunting these sea otters out on the open water. So the Promushleniki, not knowing really how to best exploit the fur trade in Alaska, took hostages and forced the Aleut population to hunt for them, and in many cases overhunted and destroyed the native wildlife population. One of the things that these early Russian settlers did was drive the sea cow, what was it? Like a northern manatee relative to extinction, and they nearly wiped out the sea otter population as well. So the Shelikov-Golikov Company, after about 20 years of that, they formed in the 1780s, and they were kind of losing their profitability by the late 1790s. The Russian crown sponsored a sort of successor, the Russian American Company, headed by Russian nobleman Baranov. And he kind of reinvigorated efforts to gain profit from Alaska. He founded a new capital and started a more friendly relationship with a lot of native tribes. He tried to expand east into the Alaskan Panhandle and even down eventually into California to find new sources for furs and otter pelts, seeing as how the Aleutian Islands had started to lose their productivity. And in many of these places, they tried to cooperate with the natives more closely to keep the part of the reason they saw profits declining in the Aleutian Islands was because they had kind of wiped out a lot of the native population, and those were the guys who were harvesting for them, so they needed new. Because there was only about 800 Russian settlers in Alaska at any one point, they relied heavily upon trade with natives as well as Americans. So around 1800 is when they start having, with their expansion east, they start having contact with the Hudson Bay Company, who were kind of, they had a monopoly over fur trade in the Americas at this point, pretty much. But due to Russian America being so far away from Russia, it took years to get supply shipments. So Russian America started relying upon trade with the Hudson Bay Company to supply many of their outposts. And I found some stat that was like they sent back 15 million rubles worth of furs to the capital, but they traded 3 million rubles worth of furs to the Hudson Bay Company for supplies. So like the Russian capital really was more interested in gaining the furs. They weren't really interested in supplying their colonies, and this kind of hurt them in the long run as the Russian American company overexploited the furs in an attempt to compete with the Hudson Bay Company on a global scale. And they overexploited the sea otters down in the Alaskan Panhandle and all along the West Coast. There were, at the same time,
Let me
as
help you a
Russian,
little bit. Hold on. You've given us this kind of linear narrative. What I haven't heard yet is decolonization.
yeah.
When did it end and how? It sounds like what you're telling me is that you have a case that's really unlike any of the others, in that it was more just Russia sort of throwing in the towel and leaving rather than anything else, and the indigenous population dying off. So was that decolonization in the same sense?
So what I was kind of trying to tell with like the history of the Promosheniki and this capitalist venture from Russia was that like the Russian state and monarchy was never really invested in it because it was kind of like a private venture. Like even their expansion across Siberia dating back hundreds of years, the Russian crown wasn't really used to actually needing to manage their eastern expansions. They were just kind of like gaining passive income from the tribute that these independent fur traders were sending back, and they didn't really govern them very much. They gave them a lot of independence to do as they pleased with the native populations, and as long as they were being productive.
In other words, though, there was really no anti-colonial resistance to speak of, right?
Not really successful. There was a Russian settlement that was destroyed by the native Tlingit tribe, but they sent in like some gunships and destroyed the belligerent tribe afterwards, and that was kind of the last resistance from natives.
So you have a case then where the issue of the colony, first of all, wasn't really linked except through tribute to the Russian state, first of all. So it wasn't a state enterprise in any sense. It's open. Hold on. It's an open question as to whether or not it was even imperialism, strictly speaking, rather than just a commercial venture. So that's another part of that. And then there was really no anti-colonial struggle, no sustained movement, no emerging leadership, no co-opted indigenous class, nothing like that. Is that right? But the reason why I'm emphasizing that is if that's the case, that's fine, but you got to make sure you tell us in your final analysis that, you know, you can say this is a trading colony. You know, the Reinhardt gives us those three kinds of colonies. Clearly, this case could be argued to fit into one of those cases at least, right? But the way in which it was eliminated doesn't involve what we've normally been talking about as decolonization. Not at all. And that's fine. Just make sure that you can explain why, and then you'll be fine. Because we talked about this several times. You have a very peculiar case. In some ways, it is unique compared to all the other cases that we've talked about. There are things about it that are unique to the case study sample we're dealing with here. I just think you need to be aware of that and be comfortable with that and explain you can argue that as a commercial venture, this was operationally, according to Kennedy, Reinhardt, this would classify as a colony, like a colony for trade, but it wasn't a state venture. It wasn't even really a crown venture. It was a private thing. There was never any organized resistance in a sustained way. Nothing like, say, in Haiti or even in Mexico or anything else. I mean, there was nothing like that. And finally, it just kind of ran out of steam, is what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, it seems like it eventually was sold off because these companies were overexploiting the fur trade, and the Hudson Bay Company was out competing them.
Yeah, so it failed for largely commercial reasons. There was no political resistance as such,
Yeah.
either from within Russia or from within the territory of Alaska that we're talking about. Okay, that's fine. Just make sure that you're clear about that, though, and you'll be okay. All right. Any questions, comments?
There's something in chat I saw.
Doesn't look like it. Who's going next?
Can I go next?
Sure.
All right. So the country that I'm looking at for decolonization is India. And so their process is kind of long and a little complex, but
Oh, you're going to
overall, in the
fly over it
beginning-
very quickly.
right. So in the beginning, it was colonized first by the Portuguese, and then the Dutch and the French, and ultimately the British, who established the East India Company, which was a private trading company, but it was very closely tied to the British Crown. So they basically set that up in India there as like a resource-based colony, primarily extracting spices and stuff like that. And then India's large population was also a huge draw for the British. But then in 1857, there was a rebellion by the soldiers, and that rebellion was unsuccessful, but it did like make a lot of changes in the British and their rule over India, and they established what was known as the Raj, which basically was a direct rule from the British Crown. They sent a viceroy, which was who ruled like in place of the British Crown, but they also ruled over like the collaborating class, which was like local indigenous princes who govern like the states around India, because India was primarily made up of like certain states around the country, and the like indigenous people were mainly Hindus and Muslims, and so that would later kind of create problems. But for now, the British kind of just established their colonies in India through both direct and indirect rule. Let's see. So those indigenous rulers or the princes, they were like educated by the British. They were taught English, and they were very loyal to the crown. And so that's why that system worked so well, is because they had mutual trust for each other. And so over the years, there was kind of growing discontent, or they were growing against the British rule. And so they created the Indian National Congress, which was made up of all Indians, and they basically throughout the years were kind of like Indian nationalists and wanted Indian independence ever since that rebellion in 1857. And so there's a lot of well-known leaders of that Congress, one of them being Gandhi, who was like the most well-known figure in the whole decolonization process of India. And so basically he and the rest of the Indians, since they not only supplied so many soldiers and resources for British, they felt like they should be treated more fairly than they were. And they were also taxed pretty heavily. And later on, or also, the indigenous people had like an opportunity to kind of move up in the ranks through the Indian Civil Service, which was made up of both British people and Indians, although the Indians were only able to, they kind of had a ceiling on like what position they could hold in that service. And so that kind of was frustrating because they felt like although they had some power, they weren't able to get as much as they wanted and as much of a voice. But the primary like reason that, or the big thing that happened that like really got the decolonization process going was the World War, specifically World War II. And so, like I mentioned earlier, the Indians, they produced a very large amount of soldiers for the British Army. And so they fought on Britain's side in the wars. And in the Second World War, Britain declared war for India without consulting India. And so that led to the Quit India movement, which was led by Gandhi and a few others. And so basically that was just a whole period of like civil disobedience and like nonviolent protests and kind of like avoiding British goods and things like that. And so that just like increased the growing like nationalism of the Indian population. And also back to their the supplying of soldiers in the war. And so that Quit India movement led to like a lot of those nonviolent protesters getting jailed for their actions. And so all of these factors kind of were put in the same thing as like reasons why the Indians wanted independence. And so ultimately, the war really had an effect on Britain's funds. And so they were kind of realizing that they didn't have as much say in India as well as enough funds to kind of keep it as a colony. And so because of all of those things, they realized that independence was kind of inevitable for India. And one thing that the Indian National Congress was kind of having a hard time figuring out amongst themselves was what to do with the fact that there's a lot of Muslims and a lot of Hindus in India. Some Muslims and Indians wanted to stay together and have one big India, but some, like, I forget the leader's name, but he was head of the Muslim League, which was basically primarily Muslims in India who kind of felt like they wanted to be separate because because Muslims are the minority in India. And so they felt that since they're the minority in a country, they would not have as much say in the government as they would. So they kind of wanted to be separate from India. And so they ultimately got their wish because in 1947, a few years, the British granted independence for India, but they also created Pakistan, which was the Muslim majority country, and India being the Hindu majority. So that all of those factors kind of there wasn't like a single event that, I mean, there was, but I was more of like multiple events coming together, unfolding kind of after each other to like make the British realize that it wasn't going to work for much longer because the Indians really wanted their independence and they felt like they were doing enough to deserve that. And so after they were given their independence, there were some problems between the separation of the Pakistan and India because of like, they just basically cut India in a certain spot and said, this is Pakistan. So there were some Hindus there who wanted to, or I haven't really looked into that part as much, just because it happened after, but Yeah, so those two were split when the British left.
Yeah, I think what you're thinking about is Kashmir there.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of things, but particularly one. One of the things you said was that the Congress Party was pretty much all of India. It's clear that it wasn't. Okay, I would really caution you that it was not, and that's
Okay.
important because along with that, now again, there's controversy among historians, but this is something I've always been a little suspicious about, is the really central role of Gandhi in the ultimate independence of India, because there's a really compelling case that can be made that, after the First World War, okay, including service in that war and supporting the British in that war effort, there were armed movements all over India. There were violent revolutionaries who were gaining ground. Okay, they were making progress, and then Gandhi comes drifting in from as this lawyer, this obscure lawyer from South Africa, right? And he's saying, "Oh no, we can't do that. We can't be violent." There's a really compelling argument that he delayed India's independence by more than 2 decades with this whole passive resistance and all that. Now, again, that's one view, but it's a view that is commonly perpetuated by the Congress Party in Indian politics. Okay, that's important because it's something that the Congress Party controlled India for so long after independence that they controlled education and they controlled the myth making of India and everything else. There is a compelling argument that while Gandhi certainly wasn't insignificant, he may, with that movement, have done as much harm as good if the ultimate aim was get the British out and be independent.
Yeah, I've in my research, I've kind of come across the fact that like Gandhi seems like, since his movement was so like peace oriented, it seems like the more aggressive aspect of it is kind of overshadowed. And I know that I even did that in my little overview, but I definitely have seen there's been a lot more violent.
Yeah, there's another way to think about that though, and it is that also serves the interests of British historians and apologists, because they can say, "Oh no, we weren't run out. They shamed us. They made us see that, okay, we must now go." Well, that's not true. The British were exhausted after the war. They couldn't control India,
Right.
And it wasn't just like, well, we've had this for almost 200 years. I guess it's time to go. They were exhausted. And there was a lot of pressure for them to get the hell out of India.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole partition you talked about and all that, it's hard to argue that Britain had a lot of choice. They couldn't have sustained, because again, they had spent 200 years training this crack military in India and then using it as the primary, leading edge of empire. Well, those guys were going to kill them. It wasn't about, oh, we're so ashamed because you've let us beat you and you've turned the other cheek. I mean, that's just a historical nonsense, from one point of view. Again, I'm not trying to argue at all that Gandhi and that movement were irrelevant. Certainly that they weren't. But this notion that the only way it succeeded was because of this wonderful passive resistance movement seems to me to be garbage.
Yeah.
It's just it seems to me, arguing from this point of view, I can argue the other side as well, but I think it's pretty gross exaggeration.
Yeah, no, I definitely have. I just for some reason decided to skip over it. But I do have like some information on that, and I'll be sure to put both sides into my paper, because I think both sides are important to at least.
Right. The other thing is, remember, I will remind all of you, your primary focus here is the process of decolonization. Nothing in your analysis should have more emphasis than that. And it is indisputable that a component of decolonization in India is Gandhi and that movement. But the problem is, are most of us informed by this almost absurd Christ-like mythologization of Gandhi rather than what actually happened? Democracy may not come from a barrel of a gun, but independence can. But there's not a hell of a lot of evidence to suggest that independence comes from being nice to people. So anyway, just something to think about. Any questions or comments? Okay, everybody's running out. Actually, I think I'm not sure about this, but I think of everyone who's here now, Ryan, I think you're the only person in this group who I haven't talked to yet. Are you
Yep.
ready to go?
Oh yeah, I'll be really short.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm doing Equatorial Guinea. I'm just going to shorten to EG because that's usually what most scholars do. But basically, it was a colony mostly used as an outpost for slave hunting. It was first discovered, in parentheses, in Portugal by the Portuguese in 1472, but it wasn't effectively colonized until about 1778. It was under both control of both Spain and Portugal due to the Treaty of El Pardo. But this colony was basically and continually economically infeasible due to all the tropical diseases that were in the region. Basically, you'd spend all this money sending people there, and then they would try to start up shop, and then they just get sick and die. So it wasn't until later, like 1870s, did they actually start to get a grip on how to control the tropical diseases. Its resource space and strategic value was basically its connection to the northern trade routes and the southern trade routes. It was like right between them. Its resource bases included sugarcane, coca or cacao, coffee, timber, and those were its major exports. And then its strategic value is basically that the northern trade winds are just to the north, and that's a good destination for the Caribbean. And then the southern trade winds to the south of it is a good destination to South America, where Spain also had colonies and Portugal had colonies. But basically for 200, 300 years, it just remained basically a staging point, which is really good for strategic value. But later, it became a location for deportees from other countries. So as problems blew up in the rest of Africa, those African countries just started deporting people to EG. The colonizing power was Spain, but mostly on the mainland because Portugal had control of the offshore islands until later when they basically just gave up the position there, except for one particular island called Sao Tome, which still remains independent from EG at this point. The indigenous populations were the Bubi, which are the islanders, the Fangs, which are the mainlanders, and then there's like traveling Marodic beach people and other like minorities like that. Territory, like I said, was colonized because it was a close location to the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, the Slave Coast.
I'm sorry, man. I got to interrupt you for just a second. I cannot let the term beach people go by without acknowledging that is one of the coolest things to call people.
Yeah, they're like
those
beach
marauding
bums.
Beach people.
Yeah.
Sorry, man. I'm totally sorry.
It's okay. But yeah, it wasn't a real production hub until like 1910 when the coffee and cacao plantations really started booming. Timber was also profitable in the mainland, but there was always shortage of laborers. So they tried to conscript people who were indigenous there, but they didn't want to work for them. So they started importing people from other immigrants started working for them. But still there wasn't a lot of labor force. So they started forced conscripting people, which caused a big problem because obviously that's basically slavery. So, but the forced conscription's kind of like they get paid, but like really measly like pay. So it's not really slavery, but it is. So, but the government there was basically just like a commerce government with like their own self-government. It's kind of, in a way it's more religious, where like a missionary would show up and then a city would build around the missionary, like most Spanish colonies, and then a government from the religious order kind of started. Plus the enterprises in the area were quite rich, so they had a lot of power in the region too. There was quite a lot of ethnic diversity based on all the immigrants and deportees that were living there, but the main faction of people were the Fang, which were the mainlanders because it's the biggest surface area of people. Basically, the collaborator class is the people who would go into the Catholic Church because basically that was your only option. You get educated through the Catholic Church, You get employment through the Catholic Church if you're not working for the plantations and stuff like that, or doing some smaller trade jobs. And it also helped you get into political positions if you were in with the Catholic Church. So in ways, it's also a colonial institution that created the possibility for resistance, because if you just joined them in their Catholic Church dynamic, then you could get yourself into a position of power and then exploit that power, which is basically what the Fang did after decolonization, but we're not talking about after. One major Catholic event was the Spanish Civil War, which had this uprising of socialists in the region, but it didn't last very long because the Franco army kind of squashed them. But I think the most important factor is the Catholic Church, because without that, I don't think there would have been much of a dynamic there, because it's basically the Catholic Church was not only responsible for giving people power, but it was also influential on de-escalating tensions, especially with the problems with conscripted labor. People would like rebel and the church would be like, oh no, don't do that, it would be bad. And they're like, oh, you're right, it'd probably be bad for me. But so it was like the church had so much power in deciding who got to play ball, basically. But the biggest cause for the decolonization was the UN, because after World War II, well, basically after World War II, there was this great unity between all the different ethnic groups, even throughout their problems and stuff like that. But because of that Catholic Church element, the Fang ethnic group had like a majority at the time. But the UN started pressuring Spain. If they wanted to be part of the UN, then they'd have to get rid of their colonies. So they had like a provisional government, and then created through process its own independence. And then the guy who came to power was not so good, but that's history, I guess. That's basically it.
Okay, any questions, comments? Okay, one of the things that I know you were just summarizing today, but that you're really going to want to look at, and again, this is where some historians have different versions of events, so be prepared to see inconsistencies, is how the final sort of resistance came about, in it to the extent that it did, okay, but also you have to ask yourself, if the UN was telling Spain you have to divest yourself of your colonies, why didn't they do that with Portugal? You know, something to think about.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to answer it, but it is something to think about, because somebody's doing Angola, for example, and they can think, well, I don't think there was anything like that anybody was telling Portugal with respect to Mozambique and Angola, you know.
Well, I believe the main focus was that Francisco Franco was a totalitarian, and so because he wants a seat at the table,
well, but again,
show...
Portugal was a fascist regime. You know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Portugal was fascist. They were really the last of those European fascist regimes. Yeah, they actually outlasted Franco. I think I have that right. I think they both collapsed at about the same time. When Franco died, that was pretty much, fascism was exhausted. But yeah, you know, Portugal up through 1975 was fascist. Yeah. So anyway, something to think about. Yeah, Graham.
What were the marauding beach people called?
Yeah,
why do they need to be called anything better than that? Come on, Graham. What a buzzkill, man. Marauding beach people. You know?
They're called the Playros.
Playros?
Yeah,
Now
Playros.
That's not as nice as marauding beach people. Damn it, man. Haven't you ever seen marauding beach people? You know.
Yeah, San Diego, Santa Monica.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're scary, man. They come out at night. They light fires out of context. I mean, it's a marauding beach people, you know. All right. Yeah, I'm interested in reading it. I'm interested to read that in part because honestly, I don't know very much about the specifics of that history. It's one of those things it comes up in comparison with other cases at times in the readings and things that I do, but I've never made a specific study of it. So I'm really anxious to read that. That should be kind of fun.
My problem was I was really interested in post-colonialism, the struggle there, because that's where a lot of the research or literature is.
Yeah.
So it kind of made it difficult to research the pre-colonial decolonization.
Yeah, which is a shame because a lot of the cases that get studied in the discipline get studied because they were violent or they were, cataclysmic in some way. And I'm not sure you're really going to find that in your case, I mean, we have, we were talking about Alaska and Russia, and there's not some big explosion of indignant, resistance that ends it. It's just, they overhunted and overfished and they exhausted those territories and moved on. That's not really decolonization. But the fact that it's not is in itself interesting because clearly the settlement can be argued to have been a colony. So the idea here is when we think about decolonization, we tend to think about these military and political processes that yield independence. In a couple of these cases suggest it's like, we just kind of cut our losses. That sometimes is the case, which is kind of what Kennedy was talking about when he said not every one of these things was violent. But that should be interesting. I'm looking forward to that. I think everybody's gone. Who's here has presented. Am I correct in that? I hope. I'm just looking over your names again because I have notes. A lot of your colleagues bailed, obviously, because they are, let's face it, gutless. But they also may not pass the class, which is very sad, They may end up with no option other than to join a band of marauding beach people. And I don't think they're going to have the starch for that either. So, there you go. All right. I think by way of wrapping up,
Can I say something else about Alaska?
Is it important?
Well, I kind of just forgot to mention it. I was focused a lot on history in my talk. So,
Okay, what is it?
The Russian administration kind of used the same policies they used for conquering Siberia to kind of expand into Alaska. And then when that wasn't as profitable and they were worried about like conflicts overseas and it was harder to supply, even though Siberia is relatively close in some places to Alaska, they kind of just drew back to try and save some of their empire as they saw some of it at risk.
Yeah, it might be part of the model that you actually have to draw to explain why that's not like the other kinds of colonialism or decolonization that we're considering. That's
like the Russian conquering of Siberia was definitely colonialism.
No, I'm not saying it's not colonialism, but it's not the kind of colonialism or decolonizing moment that we've been taught, which makes it interesting. So I wouldn't be worried about it, but be thorough in your explanation, which I think is exactly what you're trying to do. That's fine. Now the link is there for the final draft of this thing. We need not meet next week. I don't have any links put up for you or anything else. I figure you're going to be busy. You got things to do. And one of the things you have to do is to bring this thing in for a landing. But I've mentioned this before. You have until Thursday at 11 o'clock, next Thursday at 11 o'clock p.m. to finish it and post it. Again, please, no late papers. Please, no incompletes. Let's finish this thing. Okay. Now I'm talking to everyone here who's going to finish this. The people I need to talk to didn't show up today, so that's their problem. I mentioned before, I'll mention it again. I'm more than happy to meet with any or all of you throughout the week, next week. If you just, if you have questions or you want me to look at a draft or you've got a Google document you want me to look at and respond to or something like that, you don't have to do that. What you were required to do, this group has already done, which is, the summary that we did, I think it was back on November 5th, and then the kind of preliminary presentation that we've already done, culminating in the final draft. Okay. That's all you need to do. But if you want to run your analysis by me before the final deadline, I mean, it would be better if you didn't do it Thursday morning, just because, next Thursday morning, because that doesn't give you a lot of chance to respond to whatever I say. But, some of you are ready to go. It's clear. You just want to write the thing and move on. That's cool. But I'm saying I'm available if you have questions or concerns. Anything else before we depart for the holiday break? All right, then. I would be very interested in just hearing from those of you who have anything to say. I would say after grades are posted, so there's no question of you know, asking for favor or anything like that. I really am interested in hearing how you thought this class went and what you think could be improved or what you think worked. Okay, because obviously this is the first time I taught it. I had a lot of fun. I think this was a good group. I like a class where when I'm teaching, I'm also learning, and that certainly happened quite a bit in this class, which I appreciate. So if you have comments on that you think might be useful for me, again, as I say, let's wait until maybe the beginning of the next term or something like that. So there's no question of looking for favor on grades or anything else. You know, everybody's so paranoid right now at SOU that I just don't want their static, to be honest with you. There, I've recorded it. I've said it. SOU is full of static and I don't like it. All right. Other than that, good luck on the papers and don't burn yourself out on finals, and have a good holiday break.
Thank you.